Hi, and welcome to week 2 of Science and Symbols, Enhancing Science Instruction Through Literacy in the MCCS Era. We want to thank everyone for taking the time to submit their first reflection entries last week. We know there's a little bit of a learning curve to kind of how much you need to write and all of that, and so we hope that you're excited and ready to go this week in terms of really thinking about these issues and having that critical thinking process going on about both the materials and your experiences. This week's materials are broken up into 3 distinct presentations. Partly that's to allow us to have some short presentations and then give you some activities to do in between. And partly that's to kind of keep the different topics separate. The first question of the week is about the role of text in science. And so presentation 1 for that is how do scientists use text? And presentation 2 is about student-generated text and kind of the role that student-generated text plays. The second topic is about digital media and its role in science instruction today. You can post on just one of those 2 topics, or just one of the 3 presentations, or just one question, but we do ask that you look at all 3 sections, watch all 3 of the presentations, and do the readings and activities for all 3 parts, even if you're just reflecting on one piece. So our first topic this week is, within that piece about the role of text in science, is this question of how do scientists use text? The course in general is about reading and writing and literacy in the context of a science classroom. But before we get too deep into our discussion of standards and classrooms and instructional practices, let's take a step back for a few minutes and think about why scientists in the field engage with text. So this is one of my favorite images to use. I love to put this up during a presentation and to say, I want everybody to think about what a scientist is and what a scientist does. And sometimes I ask the question and then put this up, sometimes I put this up and kind of prime my audience. But even if I don't put this up first, a lot of people, the image that comes to their mind is still an image of a lab coat and an image of a laboratory, often a chemistry laboratory, sometimes a very high-tech laboratory, because this is kind of the image that we grew up on. During the times when science has been really important in our culture, it has been tied back to people in laboratories doing work. So this image of the scientist at work, this female Lego is a great illustration of that. I love it because it's a female Lego and they made it. I actually have one in my office. But I could also put up a picture of the mad scientist. That would work just as well for people, because for a lot of America, that's what they think of as scientists doing, is being in a enclosed space and doing their work. Another interesting thing about the image of the scientist, this one, a mad scientist, whatever, is that idea of working in isolation, which isn't an accurate presentation of what scientists do, but it is often what we think of kind of as a culture when we think of scientists. Our next slide, this is, in Montana, I'd like to believe that we might think of this as our view of what it means for a scientist to do science. I like to joke that we have more people out in the field teaching about science than we have people in classrooms teaching about science, just because we have such vast natural resources and so many informal science programs out there, zoos and parks and all of that, where we have people informally teaching about science. But whether it's that we're talking about the largest Superfund site that's coming out along the Clark Fork River, coming out of the pit, or we're talking about Egg Mountain, or we're talking about research in Yellowstone, in Mammoth, with the extremophiles there. We definitely in Montana have a ton of examples of groups of scientists who work outside researching that break that stereotypical mold of the scientist in the lab coat alone in a laboratory. And I think that's really a great thing to have in our state. If I ask for people to think about scientists engaging with text, a lot of times the images that people talk about are these ideas of a scientist writing in a lab book, recording their experiments, that detail and that precision, and they have instruments and chemicals, and the idea of a scientist just sitting and writing or spending time writing outside of that lab setting doesn't come to mind as often. It's much more this kind of an idea of the scientist just writing things down. Of course, we know that we think of these scientists generating a report, but we don't necessarily think of the scientists in their process of generating the report. We just think of the scientists collecting the data. When we do look at how those reports get generated, the most common kind of venue for that is that scientists are going to read the writing of other scientists in journals as they prepare to do their own research. They do this so they can understand what's been done before, kind of avoid the pitfalls, build off of other people's work. They also do it, though, to generate ideas for new investigations, kind of even to just pilot new ideas and to use as that building block. They also write up their findings to be published so that other scientists can read them, and for other scientists to build off of their research. One key feature of this reading and writing process that involves journals is that most of it happens within the peer review process. In order for scientific writing to be published, the writing needs to be read and reviewed by experts. And then there's, sometimes revisions, and that's in many ways very limiting, and it requires a very, very great deal of writing ability and skill for a scientist to be able to write in such a way that it can make it through the peer review process. And that's something that, we often don't think about as we think about training scientists, the idea of training them to write so that they can publish. The other thing I want to point out about this process is that in an ideal world, it would be unbounded. Scientists would have the freedom to pursue whatever paths interest them. But in reality, it's actually a pretty limited process. Scientists are able to do research based on grants or other funding that they have. Possibly they're a scientist that works for a corporation, maybe they're at a university, and they are dependent on that funding, that grant funding and publication cycle. And all of those, kind of the market for grants, the market for industry, determines what they can get money to research, which then determines what they can write about. And those publishing cycles, that requirement to publish, to have tenure, it plays a huge factor in scientists being able to engage in this process of reading and writing that is so instrumental to their job as a scientist. This slide, looks a little bit different, and these are kids. Let's pretend they don't look like children. Let's pretend they're scientists. And I want to think for just a second about how, section 3 of this week is more about the impact of digital text and digital tools. But I just want to mention the impact of digital text and digital tools on scientists themselves, separate from our classroom. 100 years ago, the collaborations that scientists had were very formal, and they had these limits of communication and distance. Today, scientists are able to communicate very quickly with each other, which has allowed for some increased collaboration and some really different nuance to their work. It also allows for scientists to have writing that isn't just within that format of peer review, that maybe changes a little bit the dynamic of becoming a good scientific writer. So this week, for this section, you actually have 2 optional readings. You're not required to read either of these, but I wanted to provide the reference for them in case you're interested. Some of us have experience with the world of science writing. Maybe we worked in a lab as an undergraduate, or we did an internship. I know that some of our universities and labs here in Montana will do internships for teachers where they can come in and experience being in the lab. Or maybe we came to teaching as a second field, and so we've lived in that world of scientific writing. But a lot of us don't have extensive experience with science writing. I'm a great example of that. I actually have an undergraduate degree in a hard science, and I've spent time in graduate school, but my understanding of being a scientist and writing as a scientist is very limited. And in fact, when I think about it, what comes to mind is still the lab reports that I did and the lab reports that I assigned, which I really think of as doing school more than as doing science. the more that I know about how scientists really use writing. So if you're interested in reading more about how scientists use writing, these two articles might be a good jumping off point. The first, they're both have the same primary author, and one is about written discourse in scientific communities, and it's a conversation with two scientists about their view of science, the use of language, the role of writing in doing science, and the compatibility between their epistemic views and language. And so there's a lot more in there. It's in the 32 pages of that article. There's a lot more there than just how they use writing to do science, but that is one piece of it. And then the other one is Scientists as Writers, and that was published in Science Education. And it's only a 20-page article. But those are things you might be interested if that's something that you're not familiar with. What you're going to do kind of between this section and section 2 to kind of transition into that idea of students as writers is to take a few minutes to watch this video, Literacy in Physics, Reading a Primary Source, and it's available from the Teaching Channel. And the Teaching Channel does ask for an account. It's a free account, but you may need to set one up. We'll use a lot of videos from the Teaching Channel, so if you don't have an account, it would be a good idea to set one up. And as you watch the video, I want you to think about two things. One is how the interaction with text is acting as part of the science learning in this video. And the other is what instructional strategies the teacher is using to support the activity. So as you think about those two things, that'll kind of help you prepare for the reflection discussion, or the reflection questions. Enjoy!